Don't worry too much.
No, it's all me though.
Yeah, it is.
We're good to go, Simon? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. That's it. Perfect. Thank you for solving my grief and suffering. Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to tonight's seminar that Uncle Steve Higgs is going to be doing for us on grief, suffering and depression and looking at the Bible's perspective. Before we kick off with our reading, let's just close our eyes and we'll say a prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Thank you for an opportunity that we have tonight in a quiet place to come together and to learn from your word. We come to be guided and directed around what your Bible teaches us about grief and suffering and to seek some encouragement because this is something that we see all around us in our own country and overseas especially. We see a lot of suffering, particularly at the moment through the COVID pandemic. Please be with our small group here. Please be with Uncle Steve and help him as he opens up your word to us. And we come to you through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so we're going to do a reading before Steve starts tonight, and we're going to read from Psalm 77. All right, reading from Psalm 77. I cried out to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I've considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will he be favourable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promise failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Selah. And I said, this is my anguish, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I'll remember the works of Yahweh. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I'll also meditate on all your work and talk of your deeds. Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? You are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength among the peoples. You have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you. They were afraid. The depths also trembled, and the clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Your arrows also flashed about. The voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea. Your path was in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So after that reading, now call Uncle Steve forward to come and give his talk on the grief, suffering and depression and the Bible's perspective. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Ben, and good evening, everybody. So tonight is a seminar. Now, a seminar is a bit different from a talk. So I'm not just going to stand up front here and talk to you. I want you to do a good deal of the thinking and some of the talking. Is that okay? Good. So let's start with the little bit of physical activity. Luke, do you mind handing one of those out to each person? And Charlotte, do you mind handing one of those? They're different sheets. So each person needs to get 2 pieces of paper. All right? Thank you. All right, well, it's a pretty topical subject, isn't it? And my guess is that almost any week of the year over the last few years, it would have been a topical subject because there's lots of grief and suffering all around the world. Does anyone recognise where that photo might have been taken and why the people are looking unhappy? Yeah, it's a COVID photo. Where is it from? India, that's right. Yeah, just in the last week. Yeah. So there's some real suffering going on around the world, and not, of course, just because of COVID. Can anyone think of any other reasons why there's suffering happening around the world? Thanks, Luke. That's great. Yes, yeah, lack of income, which may or may not be related to COVID. Yep. Pardon? What about Americans? Oh, yes, there's plenty of rioting happening there. Yes, that's right. Yep. So they've got their fair share of suffering. They've had a few 100,000 people died of COVID as well. Okay.
So, Stephen, one thing we've got is incredible famine that's spreading over the world.
Yes. Can you name any particular countries?
Well, especially Africa.
Yeah, a lot of, and also I've heard that there's some terrible locust plagues as well.
That's all
Yeah.
it has been. It's less dry and it's better. So yes, and of course illnesses are spread because of human behavior.
Yes. So here's a little. This is a map of the world that was done in 2018. This is before COVID, all right? And this is, as the heading says, their self-supported life satisfaction. So they interviewed people in lots of different countries to find out how satisfied they were with their life, okay? The conditions of their life in general. And so this is a little bit like, you can use this a little bit to measure the degree of suffering in those particular countries. You'll notice Australia. So here on the scale, it says, imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. So if you score 0, you've got a really unhappy life. And if you score 10, you've got an amazing life where everything is perfect. So you notice that Australia is one of the ones that's pretty close to the top of the ladder. It's between 7 and 8 out of 10, which is pretty good. So obviously the majority of people in Australia are feeling pretty comfortable about their life. However, even in Australia, there's plenty of suffering. And you can think of people that probably you know who are suffering right now. People who are sick and suffering, people who have got a terminal illness, who may be dying, and people who have got close relatives who have died. There's a lot of suffering at any given time in the world, and even in Australia, even in this country where we have pretty much everything that we need most of the time. So it's an important subject, and it's one that we need to, it does generate a lot of questions from time to time. All right, now I've given you the little worksheet and another sheet there, so that if you like, you can write some things down, and by all means, you can give your own definition for these things, but I've just put up on the screen there a sort of a quick definition for grief, suffering, and depression. Because grief, of course, is an emotional response that we have when we experience a loss of some sort. For example, if your pet dies, you might cry because it's something that you care about, and it's when it dies, you feel that loss. If someone you love dies, the same thing, except stronger, because you have closer relationships with people than you will with your pet. And grief, a lot of people talk about stages of grief, because grief is not just a static thing. Often when we lose something or somebody who's dear to us, it's almost, to start with, it's almost like it's hard to believe that it's really happened. We struggle to comprehend and to accept the reality of it. But eventually we have to accept the reality of it. And then we start thinking about the whys and the not fairs and all sorts of things. And we have to work through feelings in our own mind about the justice of things and the way that things have happened. And we wonder what if and why God allowed these things to happen. So eventually we come to recognize that this has really happened. We become more accustomed to it, but the pain may stay with us for a very long time. That sense of loss will quite possibly never go away. Suffering is a pretty general word, isn't it? Suffering is really very similar to grief, except that it's a much wider word. We might suffer for all manner of reasons. All right, not only if someone we what's the matter?
All your definitions are the same.
Are they?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's embarrassing.
They're all exactly the same.
I copied and pasted the font, but okay. All right. Well, that's very good, because now you're going to have to do some work. So what is a useful definition for suffering? You can ignore my definition. I'm okay with the grief one. What's your definition of suffering? Sorry about that.
Ongoing.
Pardon?
Something that is ongoing. Not
Yes.
a brief event, but a continuation of the same thing.
Yes.
The physical.
It could be physical. Yes.
Could be
Yes, it could be. Torture is an example of where a person would be suffering. Absolutely. All right. And some people suffer. Some people put themselves into suffering. For example, if they wanted to train for a very long race or something like that, they might get up really early in the morning and do hours of running and this sort of thing. They might suffer. All right, they might stay up late doing work or whatever, and their body suffers. That's something that we actually allow ourselves to do. So suffering sometimes is caused by our own choices.
one which is definitely one of the highest steps of suffering. It is suffer for righteousness' sake.
Yes. Okay, so there's an example that suffering, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's possible to suffer for righteousness' sake, and that's what Jesus said. Okay, we can suffer because of our commitment to do what God has asked of us. Okay. Yes. Yes, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain or psychological pain, we are experiencing that. And Greg knows quite a lot about suffering over the last few months. And with quite specific pain. Okay. What do we know about? Go on.
Go on. With regard to suffering, interesting how it's used in the gospel as well. Like Jesus suffered or suffered. Little children means to actually put yourself in a position where you endure.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily an unpleasant, painful thing. So to suffer someone's antic is to endure them, put up with them.
In that case, you choose that. It's a choice that you make. Yes.
You can ask for it.
Okay. So depression is something different again. And I have a few slides talking about depression, but depression is a whole body response to a situation of sorrow or stress or distress which hasn't gone away and which our body responds to in a way that is harmful to us and makes it difficult for us to live our normal life. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So I've put a note on the bottom there, which isn't copied and pasted, which said that grief or suffering which is not resolved over time may lead to depression. It may not. That depression is a very complex thing. The normal word depression, we could say there's a depression in the ground over there, and it literally means like there's a hole. It goes down in there and then back out again. And depression is like a state where we, if you like, fall into a hole. Our life becomes more difficult because we are struggling to cope as a result, perhaps, of some of the suffering or grief that we have been experiencing over a period of time. But as I said, it's complicated. There are lots of factors that may be involved.
Just
All right.
One thing, Stephen. One thing these things all have is our emotional response, which actually tells us that our emotions are an incredibly big part of our lives.
They very much are.
And we need to actually realize that actually only faith in our living God can resolve much of this, because it stabilizes our emotions.
Yes, and perhaps it might be a good time to just have another look at the reading that we had tonight. And I love Psalm 77 because it's a psalm where the writer of the psalm really lays his feelings bare. And he tells us that he has these incredibly powerful emotions. And if you read through the psalm, well, let's do this as an exercise. This is your night tonight. So I want you to go through this psalm now and tell me what are the indications in these verses that the person who wrote the psalm is in deep emotional distress.
Verse 2, the latter half, and cease not, my soul refused to be sorry.
Yes, absolutely.
Refused.
So he's trying and trying and trying to get on top of this, to see meaning for it, to comfort himself, and he can't. He can't. He's struggling with it. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, also verse 4, I'm too distressed even to pray.
Yes, okay, good. What about the first part?
You don't have to sleep.
Yes, that's right. So here's a person who's lying on their bed. They're trying to pray to God and they can't. That's a terrible thing, isn't it? Imagine being so distressed that you're struggling to be able to even pray to God. And you must have terrible turmoil of mind to be like that. Lying on your bed, trying to go to sleep and you can't. It's like your mind is so busy, so full of feelings that it's just racing. And no matter what, you cannot go to sleep. Now, I've had a few nights in my life, fortunately only a couple, where that has happened. And it was a time of deep emotional distress. I won't give you the details of what it was about, but it was a very, very crisis point in my life. And you can see that the writer of the psalm, whoever it was, I think it says a psalm of Asaph. He was struggling to understand the ways of God. What else do you notice in this psalm that indicates that he's in a period of deep emotional distress?
Verse 9.
Yes, what's that?
Have God forgotten to be gracious? Have he in anger shown his tender mercy?
Right. So what is that telling us? Yeah.
That he doesn't mean that God is there.
Right, he's worrying, he's starting to doubt. He's asking questions in his own mind. He's going over questions. There's a whole lot of them, isn't there? Look, it starts at verse 7. verse 8, verse 9. Question after question after question is going through his mind. He's trying to understand, because what's happening to him has absolutely put him into a turmoil. He's questioning everything. Here's a man who is in deep emotional distress. But the wonderful thing about this psalm is that it doesn't finish there. It doesn't finish there. So he says in verse 10, this is my infirmity. And infirmity, can anyone give me another translation of that?
NLT. This is my faith. The Most High has turned his hand against me.
Okay. All right. Is that verse, which was that? Verse 11?
10.
Oh, 10, sorry. Yeah, so he's definitely struggling. I've got one here that says,
Anguish.
oh no, it's not actually a translation. Pardon?
New King James is anguish.
Anguish, yeah. So he feels this terrible sense of anguish, anxiety. But he says, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of Yahweh. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate of all thy work and talk of all thy doings. So he does something really interesting. He goes back and he thinks about what God has done in the past for his people.
Just interesting real thing of when I am weak, I can become strong.
Yes.
You know, because this infirmity speaks about that he cannot cope. He finds himself weak without help. And then
Yes.
he knows he has this firm belief in God. And that at least he hasn't left. And he goes back to what God has done.
Yes. Now, we're not going to read all the rest. Uncle Ben read it for us, but certainly what he does in the rest of the chapter is he says, you know what? God's done all these things in the past. The work of God, as the Bible tells us, it's all about saving people. All right. Who can tell me, verse 19 and 20, who can tell me what is that talking about? What people were being saved in verses 19 and 20? Anyone? Oh, sorry, Psalm 77. Verses 19 and 20. What people were being saved when God led his people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron? It was Israel being saved out of Egypt. That's right. Did they suffer? Did they suffer in Egypt? Yes. What did the Israelites suffer when they were in Egypt? Anyone know? Yep.
Unfairness from Pharaoh.
Yes, very much unfairness. They were beaten. They were probably whipped. They were made to be slaves. They were forced to build all manner of buildings and treasure cities and so on. And they suffered so much, they suffered that they were crying to God. They were crying to God in a very similar way to this psalmist here. And God did something. He got Moses to come back to Egypt. And of course, after the plagues, he led them out of Egypt. So the psalmist finishes the psalm thinking, wow, he's done it in the past. He can do it again with me. And that's one of the wonderful things about the Bible. You know, we can go through great periods of suffering, and yet God can bring us out of those things. He's done it in the past. There's lots of examples we can look at in the Bible. And that's why the Bible can be so incredibly encouraging for us. Now, I'm going to move just through a few more slides before we come back to a worksheet. So this is a rather complicated slide, but it just really talks about stressful things that can happen that may or may not lead to depression. So there's all sorts of vulnerabilities, things that might cause us. We may have a family history of depression. There may be stressful early life events. There may be elements of the way we approach life, but also there are physical health conditions. There could be sudden things that happen in our lives, sudden stressors, as they're called. or general stressors. Now, the second sheet that I gave you, this one here, I don't know whether you've seen, some of you might well have seen this before. This is something that was put together by probably a psychologist, I guess, in 1963, I think it was, 67 on the bottom. Yeah, it's on back here. 1967, quite a long time ago now. And you'll notice that he's got, I haven't changed this, I haven't updated it. You'll notice that he's got a mortgage or loan of less than 20,000, and if it's more than 20,000, it's really stressful. I was thinking, yeah, that's a bit fun, isn't it? Obviously, 20,000 was a big deal in those days, in 1967. So, but this is very interesting because what it does is it shows us a whole lot of life events, and it's sort of a relative impact score that it might have on a person. Okay, and there are obviously things on there that you would recognise are really very, very stressful and likely to have a massive impact. But some things that people don't necessarily understand or even think about are, for example, a change to a different line of work that's about halfway down the page. And many people might think, oh, new job, great. And, I'm going to have a lot less stress here, but the very fact that you're changing and going into a new environment, working with new people, creates a whole lot of new stresses. So all sorts of things there, interesting. And the idea of this sheet is that if a person's under heavy stress, they can go through and they can score themselves here and add up all the scores on the back. They sort of say, if your score is really high, then it's likely to be having a pretty significant impact on your life. And it's something you need to actively do something about. Otherwise, you may slip into a bad place. Okay, a few slides about depression. Depression itself is a response of our whole body, our mind, our body, our emotions, our everything to something. All right, it may relate to particular stressful conditions. It may, we just looked at the slide that said there's all sorts of different factors that relate to it. Often people don't understand when they're depressed. They don't know that, they don't immediately know what the cause is. They simply know that they feel different. And it's very common, as it says there, 1 in 4 females, 1 in 6 males. May be accompanied by anxiety. There's a close link there, but often it can have quite serious implications, not only for the person, but also for their relationship and even for their hold on life. And sadly, some people with very, very deep depression even feel like life is not worth living at all. And some of the people in the Bible felt like that at times. Anyone think of someone else apart from in this psalm, someone else in the Bible who felt so terrible that they felt like they didn't even think that it was worth them living? Yes, Lynette. Elijah, yeah, good example. In what time of his life? Yes. He felt like his whole life's work was completely wasted. Yes. Solomon when?
In Ecclesiastes.
Okay. Yes, that's interesting because he was meditating on the pointlessness of life. I don't know whether he felt that his life was, he felt that his life was pointless. Yes, he did. He felt that life in general was pointless. At that stage, I'm not sure whether he felt his life was pointless. Yes? Job, excellent. And why was he feeling like that, Seth?
Because everything was happening to him.
Yes. If you scored Job's life on this list here, it would be pretty bad because there are so many things that happened to him, one after another after another. Boy, that would... And yes, he prayed to God and he said, look, I don't know why I'm even alive. It would be better if I wasn't even born. He was really struggling. So it's a very, very powerful thing. We could say it's a low mood which is severe and persistent, that lasts for weeks or even months, and we don't come out of it. Sometimes we might have a bad day. That's not depression, okay? Everyone has ups and downs. They have good days and bad days. Things happen. We have to adjust to them. But if we slide into a way of living and thinking where we are always down, we call that depression. And it can go for a very long time indeed. Okay, so as I said, depression is not just a low mood that may come and go. Sadness itself isn't depression. There are lots of reasons to be sad. We usually get over them. And that's just the reality of life. Here's a little graph. A picture says 1,000 words. So normally up the top here, can I do this? Yes, I can. Here's the happy, sad, happy, sad. And then if a few bad things happen, we can go down and down. And if we stay down, if our mood stays low for a long period of time, then we would call that depression. And sometimes it takes a long time for a person to work their way through that and come out to the other side. It can be very challenging. All right, I'm going to leave that there for the moment. And let's come back to our worksheet. So there is a lot of grief, a lot of suffering, and there is also a lot of depression in the world. And there's quite a lot of mental illness that has been caused by the COVID situation in the last 15 months, I suppose now. I've got a little spot here on the worksheet for you to write down some questions. I've got a whiteboard over here. I've got some whiteboard pens, and Seth is ready to write down your questions. Okay, so what I want to do to start with is to get you to think of any questions that we can answer. Questions that people answer, or ask questions that people might ask when they're thinking about why there's so much suffering in the world. Remember, in this chapter, the psalm writer asks about 6 questions. So what sorts of questions might people ask about suffering and sorrow, war, grief, all those kinds of things? What sorts of questions might people be asking? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to write some things down on the sheet. I'm guessing that you've got a pen. Hope so. Yeah, I can turn that off. Oh, sorry. Did I mess things up? Pardon? Yeah, I think I've got.
Where it goes?
Yeah, here.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Yeah. I'll probably need one just for myself so I know what I wrote. All right, Seth, are you okay with writing on the board?
Yeah, but I have my questions for myself.
No, that's okay. You can write up other people's questions. I'll just check. That's all right. Excellent. There you go. Right, has anyone got any questions that Seth could write up on the board? What sorts of questions might come to people's mind when they think about all the suffering that is in the world?
Why does God let war happen?
Yeah, okay. Why does God let war happen? Now, God is all powerful, so he could definitely stop it, but he hasn't stopped it. Yes. Oh, you're answering the question. That's awesome. Well done. Yes, well, that is absolutely true. Okay, that is two very good answers. All right. Yes, that's right. God often does have a meaning and a purpose behind it, and also he is trying to teach people a lesson. Excellent. Okay, any other questions?
Why does God allow people to get sick?
Any other questions?
Yes, I did have one on Google. What's the root cause of evil?
Okay, there we go. We're just asking some light questions tonight.
I mean, like, why does God let bad things happen to people?
Yes. And something that's related to that, which I wrote down, why does God let good things happen to bad people as well? He's not bad. He's pretty straight too.
Straight.
It's not too bad. Anyone else got a question?
What's the point of all the suffering?
Yeah. What's the point? Is there any meaning in suffering? Is there a purpose for it? Now, we're not just making these questions up. There are many people in the world who have really been deeply troubled by questions such as this. I remember, and the children here probably won't remember this, but it wasn't that many years ago when there was an earthquake off Indonesia, and a massive tidal wave swept across, and it hit Sri Lanka really badly, and right throughout that section of the south and west end of Asia, and then right across to East Africa. Thanks, Seth. That was great. Yeah, okay. We're going to include it. So,
Because the question's got power.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't got a lot of time to answer this, but let's have a crack at it, shall we? Because it's actually really important. It's quite possible that somebody at your workplace or at your school or somewhere else at the shops or wherever, if you get into a conversation and you tell them that you believe in God, one of the first responses of some people is, I could not believe in God because, and then they will say one of these. If there is a loving God, why does he blah, 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 any one of those. Okay, so there's a lot of people who struggle to believe in God, looking around and seeing the incredible amount of suffering that is in the world today. And so it's a question that actually could touch all of us, and we need answers to these because we are in this and we never know when we might be plunged into terrible suffering either. Yes.
Also, it says that you are stuck bad things happen. It says that you're not by your side.
Ah, what a great answer, Layla. Well done. Yes, you're quite right. In actual fact, well, let's start with this one here, because that's a very good place to start. All right. So what is the root cause of evil? Because that's actually sort of like the very beginning of this subject. Who can answer that question? Go, Tim. Ah, okay. So we have to clarify now. Okay. Would you like to clarify what he meant by that?
paraphrase, because you see, people's evil isn't like people think, right? It's just bad things that happen to them.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So in that particular case, God was saying that he actually was bringing bad things upon the people he was talking to. And yes, so that is very, very true. So God does at times bring and allow bad things to happen to people. And Job would be a great example of that. Okay.
Basically, what the Lord said, if you ever want to discuss this, because the Christian word says Satan, the devil, someone who made you do it.
Yes.
And you're excused for it. But the Lord also says very clearly, from the heart of man proceed. And then he's got a long list of the evils which man perpetrates upon his neighbor.
So let's just go to Mark chapter 7, just so we can remind ourselves about this, because it's super, super important. So Mark chapter 7 and verses 20 to 23. Now, someone could read this for us, because that's your job tonight, not mine. Mark chapter 7, verses 20 to 23. Yep. Far away.
Verse 28.
Yep.
And he said, that which cometh out of the man, that defiles the man. For within out of the heart of man proceeds evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murder, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit,
Lasciviousness.
and evil eye, blasphemies, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile the man.
Great. Okay, so all sorts of evil things. And Jesus himself says they come from inside of us. They come from inside of us, and we have a problem. We can't blame anyone else. It's us. Now, and if we just go right back to the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis chapter, I'm sort of going on the fly now, so forgive me if I find it as I go. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21. Who'd like to read that for us? Yep, Luke.
And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice, and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think of or imagine is bent towards evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things.
Great. So that's a really interesting phrase, isn't it? Everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. Okay, so do you think we've answered this question? I think we kind of have, at least part of it. At least part of it. Now, to answer the rest of it, we have to go right back to the beginning of Genesis, because a lot of the other part of the suffering actually comes from what happened in Genesis chapter 2. So let's go to Genesis chapter 2, and we need to read verse 17. Who can read that for us? Someone else? Anyone? That's okay. Genesis 2, verse 17.
Except the tree of knowledge and God and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die.
That's right. You are sure to die. Did they eat the fruit?
Yeah.
And did they die?
Yeah.
Well, not immediately, but they did die. Okay, they died. So that's exactly what God said. They became mortal. They were very good at the beginning, but they ate the fruit, they disobeyed God, and they died. They became mortal. And you know, being mortal is not just dying, is it? There's a whole lot of other things about being mortal that aren't very good. Okay? We get sick, we get diseases, we get hungry, and if there's no food, we can be starving. And it doesn't just mean when the Weet-Bix has run out. Okay? It means when there's no food in the shop or in your house, then you're really starving. And all sorts of other things. But also there are all sorts of other problems that we become subject to because of the weakness of our own nature. And if we fall over, we might break our arm or break our leg. We have physical pain and suffering. People jump in their cars and they have a car accident and they get physical pain and suffering and great trauma. All of those things are part of the world in which we live. So, and that's one of they are the main reasons why we suffer grief. Now, God could have chosen to start his creation a different way. He could have chosen to make Adam and Eve perfect so that they couldn't sin. He could have made them like robots so that the only choice they had was to do God's will. He didn't choose that. Does anyone know why? Why didn't he choose to make Adam and Eve like a robot only so that they only ever did exactly what God wanted with no thought of anything else? Go.
So he would know if they would actually love him.
Exactly. He wanted people to love him. He wanted people to choose to serve him. Now, of course, if you give people the opportunity to choose to serve you, what do you also give them the opportunity to do? To choose not to serve. That's right. And so Adam and Eve have what we sometimes call free will. They had the choice. They could choose to serve God, or they could choose to serve themselves. They could choose to disobey. And sadly, they chose to disobey. And of course, that the punishment for that was death and the beginning of all of the things that we have in the world today. Now, that's very sad. And so we see, so this is also part of the answer to these questions here. Why does God allow people to get sick? Why does God allow war and suffering and all of those sorts of things? Well, because they are all consequences of the choice that God made to give men and women and children free will. He wants people to choose to serve him. He wants people to choose to serve him because they love him.
Just referring back to what Paul says about those who actually ignore the truth of God.
Yes.
Romans 1, where he says that if they do so, for this cause they are taken up unto vile affections, etc. You know, all this obnoxious behavior people go into because they do not acknowledge God in their lives.
Yes.
They're left to a reprobate mind, which is the mind of our natures. And that is one of the things why we need God, because there is power within us which is mighty strong.
Yes, absolutely. And God provides a greater power, but only if we tap into it. Yes. So let's come back to our worksheet. Partway down it says, what does the Bible reveal about the causes of grief, suffering and depression? Well, what could we write down about that? Well, perhaps firstly, it's related to the fact that God gave man free will. Secondly, the heart of man is prone to it's the source of all of those sorts of evils. And sadly, what do we know from history? What way have most people gone? Which way have they chosen to exercise their free will? Towards God or towards themselves? Themselves. And so we live in a world that is dominated by people who are seeking to please themselves. Well, let's look at the next one. Can you think of Bible examples of people who suffered a lot? Let's see how many examples we can get. We've had Job. You can write down Job there. Joseph, yes, that's right. Joseph suffered a lot. Remember, Joseph was actually sold by his brothers, became a slave in Egypt. Then he was falsely accused, and then he was thrown into prison, and he stayed in the prison for a long time. And then when he helped someone to get out of prison, or when he told them the meaning of their dream, the person forgot him. So he suffered a lot. Yes. No, you're stretching. Go on. Paul, yes, good example. Paul suffered tremendously. Mary, interesting. That's a good one. Yes, it says that a sword would pierce her own heart. She suffered because she was the mother of the Son of God. You know, you just imagine that day when she was walking home from the temple back to Nazareth, and she suddenly realized that she'd lost the Son of God, and she was his mum. It was her job to look after him, and she lost him. Man, the sword would have pierced her heart through then. Yes, another person? Jesus, yes, he suffered a lot. Okay, so there's some great examples there of people who suffered. Okay, what insights are recorded in the Bible about people who endured suffering? Now, do you know what an insight is? It's kind of like something they learned from it, something they learned from their suffering. Now, I'm going to actually, because we're running out of time, I'm actually going to give you some passages here to turn up and have a look at. So we've got a few people who are fairly busily involved here. So Charlotte, can you turn up Genesis 45 and verse 7 and 8? Luke, can you turn up Genesis 48 verses 15 and 16? Seth, can you turn up 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 29? And Layla, can you turn up Romans chapter 8 and verse 28? So we've got 4 different passages there. See what they teach us. Are you good with that? So Charlotte, Genesis 45 verses 7 and 8.
And God sent me before you to preserve you, push you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So it was not you that sent me hither to God, and he hath made me father to Pharaoh, the lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout the land.
Great. So here was Joseph at the end of his sufferings. He was now second in command of the whole land of Egypt. And he looked back over that whole period of suffering and he said, you know, it wasn't really you who sent me here at all. It was actually God. I can see God working through all of my sufferings. I can see there was a reason for it. It was all about saving you. And he was able to interpret and understand the reason for his suffering and could see that God had a plan with his life and with the life of his brothers, that he was working to change them for his kingdom. That was a wonderful thing. So he had an insight that God was using suffering for a good purpose. And this is answering this question here. What is the point of the suffering in the world? For some people, the suffering brings them to a greater understanding and love of God. Okay, next one. Genesis 48, verses 15 and 16. These are words from the man Jacob towards the end of his life.
Then he blessed Joseph and said, May the God, before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked. The God who has been my shepherd all my life, to this very day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May he preserve my name and the names of Abraham and Isaac, and may their descendants multiply greatly throughout the earth.
Okay, so the bit that I'm most interested in there is the bit where he talks about, and I just didn't quite have it myself, so I'll get it, where it says, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil. So again, Jacob had had a long and difficult life, and he looked back on all the suffering he had endured, and he could see that God was with him every step of the way. And so despite the fact that he had suffered, he was able to make meaning of that suffering, and he was able to turn back and to thank God and to see that actually God was saving him all along. He was working to save him, to redeem him from all evil, and shepherding him his whole life long. That's a wonderful thing. If we can have an attitude like that, we can get through the sufferings that come upon us, because they will, because we believe that God is in our lives. All right, 1 Kings 1:29, Seth.
And the king sware and said, as Yahweh liveth, that redeemed my soul after distress.
That's actually enough. Who was saying this? Do you know? Yeah, King David. And again, he was right at the end of his life. This was when Bathsheba came to him to say, there's a rival king. Didn't you promise Solomon was going to be king after you died? And this is the beginning of David saying, yes, Solomon is going to be the king. And it was shortly before David died. But he there also recognized that God had been there all through his life. Now, David had been in some pretty difficult situations. You remember that David was an outlaw for quite a few years. He suffered terribly. He was persecuted by Saul. And all of Saul's most valiant warriors were chasing David and his men. And yet David saw that all that suffering was actually under the hand of God, and that God had saved him. Now, later in the New Testament, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Now, this is something that applies to everybody.
For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth quickly and with finality.
Romans chapter 8?
That's 29. Chapter 9.
Yeah, chapter 8, verse 28. You read very beautifully.
And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them.
Excellent. So that's a very, very beautiful verse, which tells that God causes everything to work together for good. And that includes suffering. And if you think about it, we also had mentioned before that Jesus suffered. And we know that Paul says in Hebrews that Jesus learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Jesus' comfort zone was stretched and stretched and stretched. The more he suffered, the more he learned the full measure of what being obedient to God really was. He was never disobedient, but he learned more and more in greater and greater ways as his life continued. The meaning of choosing to obey his God. All of those things work together for good.
I was just thinking, how come you can be in God and the suffering you can ultimately become the good you can learn? But there's a lot of people in the world who suffer all their life and it never comes to any good or any meaning. So just because you're in Christ doesn't mean you're not going to have suffering, but it comes to good.
Yes.
In the world, you're not going to have a life free of suffering because you don't have God.
True.
And And if you do suffer, it can come to nothing. So what's the difference?
Yes, good question. That is a very good question, and again, it partly relates to a number of these questions, because if people have turned their back on God, what happens is, in the past, people have turned their back on God, and generations have gone by, and generations of people have come and gone who don't know God, who don't know anything about God, who've never read the Bible. And when they suffer, they don't understand why. They don't know the meaning of it. And the psalmist also writes of these people, he says, like sheep, they are laid in the grave. And the end of their suffering is death. Why are they like this? It's because generations of people have turned away from God. The beauty is, of course, that they don't suffer in death, because death is an unconsciousness. There is no suffering in death. We don't believe in eternal torment. That would be cruel and unjust. But these people, yes, it's the end result of generations of people choosing to exercise their free will to turn away from God. And so God has given everyone their life as a gift, but he has distributed randomly throughout the world the natural sorrows and griefs that come as part and parcel of being a mortal human being. And some people experience a life of relative affluence, others experience miserable lives. That is the life that they have. And there is no meaning if there isn't God. I'd like to finish with one last quote from Hebrews, because I think it's really, really important. When we talk about suffering and trying to find meaning in it, in the end, the hope of eternal life in the kingdom of God is the answer for enduring suffering. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 6, verses 18 and 19. Simon, do you want to read that for us? Hebrews chapter 6, verses 18 and 19.
That by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil.
Okay, so the Apostle Paul uses some really interesting metaphors here. We don't have time to go into detail. When would you flee for refuge? When would you flee for refuge? Yes? Yes. Okay. What were they fleeing from?
The Midianites.
Yes, the Midianites. Yes. And when the Midianites came up, they had to hide. So yes. All right. So if you are under attack, if you're threatened, if you're suffering, what the Apostle Paul says, we can flee for refuge. Where to? To God. To our faith in God. To our hope in God. To the promises God has made. That's what it says. Who have fled to refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. When we're in trouble, when we are suffering grief, when we are perhaps in a state of depression, we can still look to the hope God has given us. And then verse 19, he says, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. Now, what is an anchor used for? Where would you find an anchor? Cyrus? That's right. And what do they use the anchor for? Yes, to stop the boat from moving. When they want to be stopped, they put down the anchor and it hooks into the seafloor and it holds them still. Now, particularly in stormy seas, it's very important that the anchor is good and that it hooks in well. And that's what he's describing here. He says, our hope of the kingdom of God and everlasting life is like an anchor for us, sure and steadfast. Because all the trouble that happens is like a big storm in our life. The grief and the suffering and the wars and illness and even death itself. They are all storms in our lives. But the hope God has given us is like an anchor. And it hooks us in and we don't let go. And that is what God has given us. And that is ultimately the reason why we can continue to exist and endure despite sorrow and suffering in our lives. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for that, Steve. We'll now close up tonight. Is there supper tonight? Does anyone know? There is,
Yes.
and there's a nod. Okay, great. There's supper. All right, I'll give thanks for the supper as well then. We'll include that too. All right, so let's just say a closing prayer now. Our Father in heaven, once again, we come to you, and now it's to close our meeting. We thank you for the message that we have heard, that we have you to rely on, and we can look to you knowing that you have all things under control, and that difficulties we might be going through in our life, you are controlling, and you are using them to improve us and to turn us into better people, and that you won't give us more than we can bear. We thank you for this comfort that we have to know and to understand, because each of us have different troubles in our lives from time to time. Thank you for giving us food and drink as well. As we have this supper tonight, we're grateful for it, and we offer our thanks through Jesus Christ, your Son.